My name is Muhammad Nour-Elkhairy, and I'm an associate programmer with Cinema Politica and a filmmaker and a video artist. And we're thrilled to virtually welcome you to Fluid Frames from the Palestinian Diaspora, an event dedicated to the work of Palestinian artists working and living in the country known as Canada. Tonight with us are fellow filmmakers, Razan AlSalah from Montreal, based in Montreal, Syrian Husni and Rana Hamadeh, based in Toronto, whose work is part of the program, along with my work and the work of Rehab Nazzal, who couldn't be with us this evening. For those who haven't seen the program, the films are still going to be available and accessible until Wednesday evening. So you still have time to check out the work that we will be talking about today. Tonight's event is part of Israeli Apartheid Week Montreal and is co-presented with the Toronto Palestine Film Festival. I would also remind everyone that you could still donate to the GoFundMe campaign to reunite Omar bin Ali with his family. Omar is a Palestinian refugee and activist living in Montreal, known to many for the Status for Omar campaign. Omar has finally gotten status in Canada after a long struggle, but is now trying to reunite with his family. So we will share the link to the GoFundMe page in the chat. As we wait to celebrate political cinema and activist cinema once again in theaters, we hope that Cinema Politica events have helped you stay engaged and inspired. In the meantime, please check out offerings on our Cinema Politica on-demand platform, sign up for our newsletter, and follow us on the social media so you can keep up to date and informed to upcoming events. We'd like to begin this event by acknowledging that Cinema Politica's main office is located on the unceded land of the Ganyangahaga Nation. We believe it's not enough to acknowledge the title holders of the land where we live and work. Rather, we urge everyone who attends our screening to become involved in anti-colonial and indigenous-led struggles and resistance in Tiohtià:ke and beyond. Tonight, we are hosting our event on the Zoom platform, which is headquartered on the Mwekma Ohlone territory. We acknowledge indigenous stewardship, presence, and sovereignty beyond land into these virtual spaces as well. And so now I'd just like to do a quick breakdown of the events. We're gonna start off with the brief introductions, and then we're gonna have a 30-minute discussion with the filmmakers and the guests about the work that is part of the program. And after that, we're gonna open the floor for questions from the audience. So if you do have any questions, please send them via our webinar or as comments on YouTube and Facebook, where we're also gonna be streaming live. And so now I'd like to introduce our guests for tonight. So the first guest is Razan AlSalah, who is the director of Canada Park and Your Father Was Born 100 Years Old, and so was the Nakba. Razan is a video artist investigating the material aesthetics of disappearances of places and people in colonial image worlds, breaking these thresholds of view into elsewheres where colonialism no longer makes sense. Her work has been screened in community-based and international films. She teaches at Concordia University in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. Our second filmmaker is Rana Nazzal Hamadeh, whose films Something From There. Rana is a Palestinian-Canadian artist and activist immersed in community organizing, both across Turtle Island and in occupied Palestine. Her work takes interest in the complexity of decolonial disruptions and in drawing attention and care to the land. Rana holds a MFA in documentary media from Ryerson University and a BA in human rights from Carleton University. And our third filmmaker is Syrian Husni, whose film is Zinco. Serene is a writer, translator, and filmmaker. She holds an MFA in documentary media from Ryerson University. Through the Shoes Project shorts, she is currently co-mentoring 6 refugee and immigrant women in making personal films centering shoes and stories of migration to Canada. So welcome everyone. How's everyone doing?
Good, thank you.
Great. So I'd like to kind of start the discussion discussion reflecting on what I think is like one of the really big themes in all of the work that has been selected here. And it's really this idea that, each of the films are in their own way visualized displacement. They really kind of capture each in their own unique way that paradox of simultaneously being temporary and permanent as a refugee. And I think, for Palestinian refugees, this state of kind of temporarily waiting and kind of this notion of waiting for the right of return and being kind of stuck in this space, it really manifests all of the works present and is kind of visualized in different ways. And I'd like to, I wonder what it was like for each of you. Is that something you think about? How much is that of that kind of idea of displacement comes in while you're developing work or you're thinking about work?
I can go first. So, I mean, I'll start with your father was born 100 years old, and so was the Nakba. It was a time when we were, starting to think about digital spaces as disembodied spaces and kind of being there, but being disembodied, and that confusion. And I was like, wait a minute, like this is not the digital condition, this is the Palestinian condition. Yeah, that's how I kind of thought about Google Street View, and it very much kind of came out of that need to encounter Haifa, where my father was born and where my family's from. So I very much kind of embodied that, my grandmother returning, but still like it was an encounter for me. It was the first time I encountered a city that I've never been in, that I cannot be in, and yet have an emotional connection with. So it came out of that inaccessibility to the land, and I was kind of trespassing the colonial border through that digital space. But I didn't know that once I encountered the aesthetics of Street View, how Street View is made as an image world, that I would be kind of clashing with that, because you're in that space. It's photorealistically familiar to my grandmother, supposedly, and yet it's completely disembodied. You're floating. These images are more like walls than actual space, and although they're built in such a way that creates that perspectival immersion that gives that sense of place, yet inaccessible sense of place. So I felt, definitely, I felt like that space really manifested like the infrastructure of colonialism in the way it's built, and maybe we can talk about that later, but also manifested that feeling of displacement. And yeah, that's how like I felt, okay, I can make a film here and kind of carry through that moment. And I totally agree on the temporality as well. Like, it made a lot of sense for the film to talk about the moment they were forced out of their home, the moment they escaped, but also the moment of encounter, of return. So as if the escape and the return are in a kind of a constant loop. And I almost feel like the film is a trap, like a narrative trap that keeps looping.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting to think about, kind of that digital space, really like a embodied space, but also like through a corporate lens. It's not just embodied, right? It's still Google View, right? So that's like very much something that is part of the kind of detachment and the disembodiment that's in the work, which I think is very interesting. But then also becomes really great, I think, if once you think about like we're going from this completely digital embodied space, and then Rana, in your work, it's this totally tactile, totally felt, totally material experience. And it's kind of really, I love that play of the two of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I would definitely say that the film came out of displacement. It actually was born out of this strange thing that kept happening where people kept asking me for soil every time I went home. And the first person to ask was my dad, who's a 1948 refugee. And he hasn't been back since then. And it's his voice that we hear throughout the film. But, you know, even my maternal grandmother, who's never been displaced at any point, she also, at one point when someone in the family got a permit to go to Jerusalem, she asked for soil from there, and she put it's in a bag beside her bed. She put it into her will that when she is buried, she wants this soil sprinkled over her. It also makes you think about how, you know, even for folks who haven't been displaced, they have been removed from the land because they aren't able to access the land, even if they haven't been moved. But yeah, I think all of it was, the interest for me was like, how do we use material symbols to build that connection to land when we don't have it in front of us? Because we know that the settler-colonial project that has impacted all of our lives, like that it's trying to sever that relationship. And so I'm really interested. I mean, I chose soil, but I could have chosen anything. Like, you know, people hold on to the old keys of their homes. I mean, you know, that key isn't going to work. That door doesn't exist anymore, but they still hold on to that because that's a material thing that connects them against all odds, against the reality in front of them. And that, I think, is really powerful in itself.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, if we continue, Serene, with your work, it kind of, you know, that same notion, these same notions of like, you know, that even if you're sometimes in your home, you're still displaced, right? Because it's that access really becomes architectural in your film, right? Like it's about those spaces that people are living in and they're talking about, and kind of, you know, I'm interested to know how you feel about that.
I think in my case, I'm talking about refugees, like as official as it comes. Jordan has one of the biggest populations of Palestinian refugees registered with the UN. So in the most formal kind of legal sense of the term. And at Talbiya, the camp I chose, is one of the smallest of them, actually. And for me, I remember at some point walking kind of in this space of the camp and kind of realizing how all this tactile, like this material, this construction material, what they use to build their homes, is actually like a sort of literal manifestation of displacement. It's like the longer they're there, the more the material becomes less organic and more sort of like concrete and reinforced concrete, and it's just more there. At the same time, politically, they exist in a strange temporality or in a liminal space, in the sense that, okay, they're never gonna find home in this land where they are, because, you know, that there's kind of the whole, how different Arab states politicize the whole idea of normalization. So it's like, well, if you are allowed to build homes or, you know, expand vertically or expand horizontally, and as the refugees grow and the families grow and time passes, that the whole idea is if you are given kind of the space to grow or to take place, actually literally take up place, find your place, it would be a kind of normalization of you know, that you're refugees, or you would be denied your rights of return. And so even in a sense of what urban rights, or what literally like urban rights, what rights do you have to build a home, to grow a family, even that has to stay in this liminal space, in this strange temporality of like, yeah, this embodiment, as Razan, I cannot put it any better than that. So yeah, that was kind of the feeling I got at some point walking in the camp and wishing like all this would disappear, in a sense, to go back in time somewhere else.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting because even, you know, this idea of this kind of state of being this kind of, you know, has become so normalized in the Palestinian experience that kind of we almost kind of think of it as normal and real, but then we really don't necessarily talk about kind of how we like just the impact that it has on the individual and on people. And I think that something that for me in my work I try to explore is also this kind of idea of how it affects the individual in terms of the anxiety there of articulating oneself and trying to talk about oneself in this language that sometimes is not really particularly able to articulate all of those things. And I think one of the things that also comes through in all the work is also that in a way where all these films kind of embrace in different extents this kind of experimental language and in different ways and poetic ways to try and articulate that tension, which I think, you know, is way more interesting to me as someone who programs and makes films, as opposed to film, you know, you see these films about Palestinians that are like really can't capture that. And I'm wondering to, you know, as artists and filmmakers, how do you think about that, and what are your feelings about that to some extent?
I have a couple of thoughts. First, about what Serene said in terms of the disembodiment of that temporality makes me think that it's also like that being stuck there is also very depoliticizing on the personal level. Of course, you know, you can't really build a life, you can't really accumulate. But I'm also thinking, politically speaking, if any of the Arab states were really interested in a Palestinian political project from the bottom up, you know, civil rights is definitely very different from normalization, and many Arab states have already normalized. But when you come to think of civil rights and giving that enough stability for someone to be able to express any kind of political agenda, to move beyond the home, and so just, you know, reflecting on what you said, beyond the person, like the personal as the political, that it's completely depoliticizing when you're kind of, and Muhammad, if I can also say something about your films, like in terms of feeling that suspension in time, is also, I don't know, like if you want to talk about that, because you know, since you're in the program too, and
yeah, no, but it is kind of like, as you were talking completely, it's this, you know, especially when you're talking about the loop and this idea of this being stuck. I think in my work, a lot of the times it is this like this suspension and this inability to kind of really kind of, yeah, like it's just so removed. And, you know, if you really take it at face value, it really depoliticizes, it strips you down. It kind of like takes you in a space where you're constantly like shifting back and forth in this like anxiety that you're caught up in and you're trying to kind of think about. I think for me, like in the two works that are in the program, like in I Would Like to Visit, a lot of it is about this attempt to articulate oneself and this attempt to really like reduce that experience, that disembodiment, that kind of stuckness into like a phrase or a paragraph, and trying to kind of constantly be, you know, editing and re-editing and rewriting and kind of going back and forth in your attempt to articulate that. And I think also in Peace for Palestine, that also takes another version of it but then really deals with it when it comes to trying to now kind of having to discuss it with an outsider to some extent, right? Like trying to articulate these things with someone who may not understand it. In that specific example, I kind of talk, P is for Palestine, specifically about how, like the person in the video is repeating all these words that start with P, and in the Arabic language we don't have the letter P, so actually being able to pronounce the letter P becomes this signifier of kind of class and westernization and all these kind of problems that really end up really even problematizing the conversation, and in some way linking it back to like a larger colonial economic conversation, and kind of showing that it's not just about kind of, relationship to land. It's not just a reduction to that. It's also about a lot of that work. And I think if we kind of, think about the other work, I think it's in all of that as well, I think, Rana, Serene, and Razan, you can see that kind of, openness in those terms.
I am interested kind of in the whole idea that you brought up about form. It's like, how does this anxiety that, we carry as Palestinians and as Palestinian bodies, kind of how that translates in the form, in the cinematic language. And with Razan, it's definitely interesting, like how for me, your film is kind of mediated by it's like even the image is not yours, and as well kind of with you, Khairi, it's kind of that how much, like I guess I'm curious why you use text in a sense for, as almost like in these two films at least, like why you chose to use text as a sort of a conduit for this anxiety. I mean you talked about it a bit, about the whole anxiety, but what is the significance of articulating yourself, especially that you're one of the I find your film is one of the few, even though it is a liminal space, but you kind of articulated it. You kind of positioned yourself as a settler yourself in the Canadian settler-colonial project. So you mentioned that you situated yourself as a settler here. Just wondering about that.
Yeah, no, and I think, so for me with language, it's just, I think a lot of it has to do not just with language specifically, because I think it's kind of, language is really interesting in the sense of the written word and the limitations, as well as like the ability for it to expand and contract and kind of, you, especially now with like web, with culture on the internet, it's really about like reducing, a lot of things to a few sentences, a paragraph, a statement, a headline. And like, you're trying to articulate like, years or hundreds of years of colonialism and experience and like whatever. And then you're, and you're trying to talk about your grandmother and your aunt and your uncle and and it's supposed to all come out in like, whatever characters. And so I think for me, it was a lot of that frustration manifesting and just kind of coming out in those ways. And I also think like this is something that, I guess Razan's work we both have that exploration of now, as we're kind of talking about these things in Canada, right, on a settler colonial land, what does it mean for Palestinians to be doing this kind of work? Because if we don't acknowledge the kind of history of this land, then it's so easy for us to just be co-opted by, the multicultural project, right? And so how do you constantly and ensure that like, you don't want to be co-opted with that? By building and like, as victims of settler colonialism, what does it mean that we're on settler land? And trying to grapple with that, because I'm not even sure, I necessarily have the answer. But I mean, maybe that's an opening for Razan to talk about Canada land, but also, you know, Rana and Serene, we're all kind of in the space. I'd love to know how you guys think about it and what do you think?
Yeah, so with Canada Park, first of all, for a little bit of context, I discovered this absurd liminal space. I mean, specifically that one, let's say, called Canada Park, Ayalon Canada Park, north of Jerusalem. It's a park that was funded by the Jewish National Fund in Ottawa, specifically. And then I went into the Jewish National Fund kind of to better understand how they position themselves. And I noticed that a lot of their project is based on green colonialism, basically transplanting that park specifically to cover the raising of three villages that were raised by Israel in 1967. Amwas, Yalo, and Bet Nuba. So, and this is where, again, I use Street View to access that space, and I found a user-generated imagery of kind of a movement through the park as a cyclist, a GoPro on the helmet of a cyclist through the park. And I mean, that kind of reflects back the mobility, the free mobility of this person in a public space, but yet who is the public, right? The commons, but who are the commons? Really kind of reflects back on the formal aspect that you were asking about, Khairi, which is you know, how easily we can move through Street View, right? And that is the settler-colonial project manifested in the digital virtual space. And this is why I call them colonial image worlds, because you move from point A to point B. You are master of this world. It is kind of a product of a camera that is surveying a geolocation very precisely from one point to the other, and then allows us to kind of consume this space with liberty. And so I kind of take that footage and I really play with it because I kind of want to be as free as this cyclist. And so I move from the video game into kind of trying to understand or trying to find something that is beyond this, like jumping from one point to the other. Can we find an elsewhere in that very specific here, in that very specific material aesthetic, that politic of erasure, and of course, you know, that transplanting of the park is nothing new for Canada as a settler colonial project. It's actually a national symbol, right? And we kind of people who live in Canada as documented humans enjoy the entry to these parks as the public, and if you scratch beyond the surface, you also learn that these are zones, these are green zones where different indigenous communities were kicked out and severed from that land under the guise of protection. So these are protected areas, but actually we're just separating man from nature, and we're again kind of contributing to this separation from the ontology of the settler colonial project as man dominating nature and controlling it, right? And controlling the indigenous populations on it, including plants. And so yeah, I kind of found that as an entryway to start and understand and problematize my existence, because yes, sure, I grappled with that coming here and feeling like I'm living basically in Israel 500 years from now. But more so, I wanted to complicate that further. Like, yes, okay, and then what? Do I just like, am I deer in the headlights, or do I kind of push it to kind of recognize where I'm at and kind of work to decolonize this place, wherever that may be, because it's part of the same economy of scale of the settler-colonial project, which is global from day one, right? Yeah, I'll stop here.
Yeah, Rana, I'd love to hear your thoughts, but before we do, I just want to remind people, if you have any questions, please post them in the question and answer. You can also post them in comments on Facebook and YouTube, and we'll be monitoring all those. But yeah, sorry, Rana.
Yeah, right when the idea for this film was being formed, it was about a year, last February, right before the pandemic began. And here in Toronto, across the state called Canada, people were protesting in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en people. And right before the pandemic started in early March last year, we had just launched this campaign, which didn't go far because of the pandemic, but we were calling it Palestinians for Wet'suwet'en. And we were trying to get Palestinians to, well, part of it was bringing kind of an awareness to what was happening on these colonial lands to Palestinians across the diaspora and in Palestine. But part of it was also, being like agents of offering our solidarity. I think whether you see it in the film or not, like this ethic is something that informs it, right? Like, our movements are interwoven, not just because of, the history of reciprocal solidarity, not just because, we learned so much from the people here who have struggled against settler colonialism for 500 years, but also because the oppressive logic that, we're all fighting is the same. Even though our experiences differ, the things that we're fighting is the same, and our justice is indivisible. That's a common phrase, but it's not cliche yet. Like, it's real. Like, we can't be free unless, all colonized people are free. Yeah, and like, I think what Razan said is it. Like, our works in all different ways are talking about settler colonialism, and it's a function that's happening to the people of these lands. It's happening everywhere. We're seeing the erasure. Our films, I think a few of them really deal with like bringing back a memory or a name or anything that has been erased. And these things, like, for me, I was interested in how that happens through memory, through materials, through storytelling, because those are, big ways in my life, at least, that those histories have stayed alive, even when they aren't acknowledged officially, when, people are trying to erase, like Canada Park, the 3 villages that have been erased, like, they're not on a map, but we keep telling the story and keep them alive in that way.
I think it's really clear in your film, definitely, that relationship between the tangibility and the symbols and the metaphor of those icons, but also that kind of narrative and storytelling. And I think there's something really interesting that also is in the film, because it's your father, and there's this kind of intergenerational relationship where, your father's also telling you his stories and trying to keep them alive. And, you're looking at the pictures as well, and he's telling you about that stuff. I think, it's interesting to see that, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more about like the importance of that kind of relationship and maintaining those relationships for that purpose, right? For unearthing and keeping alive these things, much in the way that is very much like it becomes tangible in that film, which is what I think really interesting and kind of felt. And
I mean, I don't even know where to start. I feel like when I started, I really didn't want to make a Nakba film, because we were talking earlier about this like kind of being trapped, and as a Palestinian storyteller in any form, you're always trapped in some kind of reading of your work, and the Nakba is usually where you're trapped temporally, like it just always comes back to there. But for my dad, that is where he is. He was 8 years old in the Nakba, so he wasn't, or 6 maybe, he wasn't that young, and because he kept retelling the story, it's like the most vivid memory that he can share with you. He's never been back to the town that he was exiled from in 48, but he tells me all the time, if I was there, I could find my house. And who knows, like the landscape has changed so much, but people still maintain this. I think it's interesting also how this changes generationally. For a lot of people who've never seen that land, they still feel the same way, or they've created a new way to express it and to feel it. And sometimes those things happen through materials. That was what I was interested in. Yeah.
I just wanted to add something to that, like just the whole idea of us as Palestinians being stuck in time when telling these stories, in a sense, and in a sense that is the definition of trauma, right? It is being stuck, and we do. I just kind of want to acknowledge the importance of what Rana just said about the whole idea of oral history, and that also Indigenous people use that and as a means to, like to remember the names that aren't on Google Maps, to remember the names of the villages because you won't find them on Google Maps, or, to understand like that the soil, like where it comes from, what's the name of the village, because ours kind of, the whole idea of settler colonialism is kind of somebody wants to take your place, they want to erase you, they want to push you and take your place, and just kind of what I just wanted to sort of bring that up, that how important oral history and these kind of storytelling and community in a way to how important is that as a resistance, as a way of resisting kind of these formal histories that are part of the hegemony of these states that don't understand land but understand borders and etc. I was thinking about the whole idea of being co-opted as a diversity. I find that's almost a little bit difficult, because from what I understand, like if you were in Canada and you had donated to the Jewish National Fund to plant these trees in Canada Park, you actually got a tax credit, like as if you're giving charity, and that whole concept is so disturbing. I find and as Palestinians, kind of our narrative is being fought even in these spaces, in the spaces of art and cinema, and on Google Maps, and in Canada as well. I don't think our narrative is the most welcome sort of stories that people here want to hear. There's a lot of censorship and sometimes self-censorship, and so yeah, in the same way, that Indigenous people before us weren't allowed to speak their languages, and were forced into reservation schools or to cut their hair or whichever. So I'm not worried about being co-opted. That's what I'm trying to say.
I wanted to add just quickly that, like, the thing about being trapped in time, like, you can't, if you don't have a history, if you don't know, if you're denied that history, you can't imagine your future. It's like not just that the past has disappeared, like it's that you will never, like, it's such a trap of like remaining, Nakba al-Mustamirra, like the continuous colonization. It's like one big bubble, and even though I don't really think my film reads as feverish. Serene was there as I was making it. It was very feverish from the back end.
So we're starting to get a couple of questions, and I thought, maybe we'll throw in a couple. There's one question from Marion. Do you feel any link, relation, bond with the people of Kashmir who are fighting against colonization and their land by India? I feel like we kind of hinted at about the fact that, and I think Rana spoke very eloquently about, the relationship between kind of, colonial struggles being interrelated. I don't think we spoke specifically or we're talking about it, but, I think for my end, I think the one thing that becomes clearer, I think, for me is that, the Palestinian, the issue, the Palestinian question is not one that's separate, that's not related to all these other ones. The kind of interrelatedness of, struggles of independence all over the world, really relates.
And it also, sorry, go ahead, Razan.
No, go ahead.
It's also like, I mean, it's very physical, like the relationship between Israel and India and the sharing of arms, it's in part like this global struggle against colonialism, but it's also, you can trace it materially through the money, through the weapons, the sharing of these powers.
Surveillance technologies, like it's, yeah.
And Netanyahu and Modi very visibly smooching is what I wrote in the chat. Yeah, I mean, I would even push it further and say that kind of falling into Palestine as a national project rather than a project of justice against the settler-colonial project, I think is also being co-opted by, and this is where the co-optation doesn't need to be violent at all, right? Like they have their own ties to the Palestinian Authority that kind of creates their own surveillance and normalized surveillance and normalized security on the ground. Same goes for Canada vis-a-vis, Palestinian visibility narratively in the art world that Serene was talking about. The co-optation doesn't need to be violent. There doesn't need to be clear censorship. The infrastructure is so insidious that it kind of it creates the censorship before you even need today a residential school, or before you need, and under the guise of care, for example, with indigenous children today being taken away from their families, negligence in the police with indigenous women being murdered and kidnapped. I mean, yeah, just to say that, like, it's really it's necessary that we remember that it's a question of infrastructure and breaking with that infrastructure rather than a question of narrative and national narratives, specifically when it comes to Palestine. Specifically why I call the film a narrative trap, because and originally the film was made to be a video piece in a gallery as a loop, because I almost feel that she goes to the sky and then comes back to enter the Google Street View and kind of stays there in that loop. And we need a line of flight out of there, and yeah, out of that, the sense that I mean, Khairi, I know we've had a lot of conversations about that. So yeah. If you want to kind of
I know, but I feel like you've really really spoken so eloquently about it, right? I think that it is so important, and particularly now with more discussions about, like the Palestinian Authority and their role, and I think that it is really frustrating to try and talk about it without as you're trying to articulate what is going on and trying to explain that actually, no, the Palestinian Authority is part of the problem, that these issues, that reducing the conversation to a nationalist issue is part of the problem. And so, yeah, I completely feel like, it's something in my work. And I think that, like, for instance, for me, Peace Palestine for Palestine specifically is kind of about this performance of respectability, of trying to talk about it, is kind of codifying it and trying to really make it, institutionalizing it in some way that really co-opts it. And I think that's kind of part of the problem that we need to very much be addressing.
Is that guy supposed to be like a member of the Palestinian Authority?
I don't like it. I'm like, if you get open-ended is more interesting. Yeah. But you can project whatever you want on it.
That's what I project.
And I feel like you set it up as such, right? Like we're not I would like to visit, right? I would like to visit is okay. It's set up as this formally as this struggle of syntax, right? Like that and you talked about that, but formally in Peace for Palestine, I think what's interesting vis-a-vis what we were just saying about co-opting, I think the setting it up as a fiction, as a set, like a fiction set, like a narrative film, and then kind of having that camera track in and then kind of pan, I think that set creates that narrative framework as problematic.
Absolutely. No, and I mean, like, you definitely said it better than I could have, so thank you.
Because
for sure. I mean, there's other questions. I guess we can also, just to kind of also bring in other topics. There is one question from an anonymous attendee that's asking, what are the challenges that Palestinian artists who are women or other like Palestinian LGBTQ artists face while making art or presenting it? I don't know if anyone, wants to speak on that. We don't have to, I guess. If that's
I mean, I can say, I guess, a few things. I think basically a lot of artists face challenges when it comes to their works. It's not, and filmmakers, I suppose. I think one challenge that maybe we face as Palestinian filmmakers or visual artists, media artists, whatever you want to call it, is like that. It's partly that it is the language. It's like, okay, you want to, like, what is Palestine, or what do you mean by occupied territories, and it's just kind of this constant having to explain things which in its own way traumatizing, and then maybe you just kind of this whole idea of having to explain things, why you call it apartheid. It's like, I don't know, take a guess. There's like some streets for people with a certain license on their car, and other people, or like water for some people, and roads for some people, and not others, and etc. And go on and on. It goes on and on. So yeah, I think that definitely is part of the challenge. And then I think there's again this kind of fear of being, on the one hand, from this kind of national people who want to have a national, create a homogeneous or whatever national narrative for what is a Palestinian film, and why didn't you talk about the Nakba, and etc., or why are you normalizing this or that? And then that's on the one hand, and then on the other, you're facing these people that you have to explain everything to, like, what is an occupation? Is it how is it a settler colonialism project, etc., etc. And then in the end, kind of having people either be afraid, especially in a Canadian context. I think either be afraid. I think in the Canadian context, or North American in general, there is more fear of talking about the question of Palestine, and like, yeah, I think that's another thing. And then it ends up translating, or you end up being kind of having your work maybe more so becoming an esoteric or a niche or a more marginal, because it's talking about Palestine. I think these are some of the challenges.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting. There's another question kind of also around this idea of safety and feeling safety making art as Palestinians. But I think that, you know, what you were saying, I think it's so interesting about, you know, like we're at a moment in, you know, in a lot of these and a lot of countries where they really are pushing to not allow apartheid to be used with Israel, right? And like this kind of active silencing that really, like, you start to worry about, like, is this going to affect me personally? Is this going to affect, you know, the next time I want to, you know, I'm in a job interview, or I'm trying to get a fund, or I'm trying to do, you know, my work and it is really frustrating to think that, yeah, like, am I now suddenly going to become a niche, or is my work somehow like this sidebar? And I don't know. I mean, I'm sure you all feel the same way, but maybe you can talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really important that we approach this struggle as an intersectional one, so that we're not co-opted, so that we're not niche, so that we don't become an issue, so that it is recognized that the liberation of Palestine is part of the feminist struggle. Yes, is part of LGBTQ struggle, because and the reason why I say that is particularly because Israel positions itself as a liberal democracy that provides equality and rights to all, right? And that is part of its pinkwashing, you know, what we call pinkwashing, greenwashing, pinkwashing agenda, in the sense that you're almost, again, they don't need to violently erase you. You're just erased by the very fact that in queer spaces, Israel is becoming an iconic tourist queer attraction, right? And so this becomes part of the erasure, and we need to make sure that, again, we're looking at the infrastructure and not the narrative, that we're looking at these places as and their histories and their people, because we can go and just consume Haifa and the beaches of Haifa and go back, but then we will very quickly realize that when the world, and the world is partially, but when the world more and more is taken over by these systems, that we are, as any marginal community or any person that is interested in the practice of freedom, will be framed as in this project. And so, yes, of course, it is a feminist issue, it is a queer issue, And it's very important that when we're in these spaces that we don't have to explain ourselves, Serene. Yes, exactly. Like on a very basic level, that at least when we're in a feminist space, when we're in a queer space, that we don't have to explain ourselves, that, you know, and it's getting harder and harder because these are exactly the spaces where Israel is erasing and building infrastructure as a queer paradise, as a kind of a green space, a greening of the desert, etc.
I mean, which also relates so much to kind of, it's funny because there's all this kind of dialogue that comes with Canada about how it's so much better than all the, you know, and Israel also reproduces that, like, because we're good on this, then we're better than all the ones around us, then we can do this, right? Which is really interesting because it's the same exact dialogue that Canada's just like, no, well, we have this, so we're better, so our relationships with colonialism can be erased somehow. And kind of, it's that kind of same, you know, it's the same language, it's the same kind of, you know, systems at play.
Yeah, but not like, I know that this is a whole like branding with this like nation state and etc. But like, you know, you cannot legally get married if you're a gay couple in Israel. If you're both Jewish Israelis, you definitely can't get married. Like if you are a Jewish Israeli wanting to marry a Palestinian or Christian or Muslim, whatever, like gay person or, you know, so, or queer person. And then again, like there's an interesting part of that whole, like the whole barriers to entry is also when we as now Canadians, we have like these passports, how we can access as we try to access that land back. And then that there's that whole kind of, all these kind of unwritten kind of rules that, oh, you know, if they think, if you say I'm going to visit my girlfriend in Tel Aviv, like if you pretend to be queer, or if you are queer, especially if you're a queer man, oh, I'm so scared to go to Ramallah, I just want to go to Tel Aviv, then they might let you in, kind of thing. And so it's just kind of messed up sort of, I think hypocrisy, yeah, totally like pinkwashing, but it's like the fact is there's no gay marriage, sorry, because this is a religious state at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. I think even for a lot of people here who are very critical of Israel, they still internalize that, like that subtle belief that, you know, that Israelis are more, I mean, it's a colonial thing. They're more civil, they're more progressive, they understand women's rights, they understand queer rights, like, and that whole construct is all about, in the end, who's like a real person who can actually think, and who's just like oppressed and oppressive and whatever. And you know, I'm sure all of you have had this experience of like people really wanting to hear your narrative as like an oppressed Palestinian woman, you know, like people want to hear about your oppression in that way only, often not about, you know, not about the colonialism, but about the patriarchy of Arab men or whatever. And it's not like we don't experience patriarchy. We experience a global patriarchy here, there, like we do. And it's a lot of the time you feel like people are trying to suck out one narrative from you because it kind of suits that subtle, suits that, like, you know, the pinkwashing narrative, the whatever, that is really ingrained in folks. And I think all of us are transnational in some way. And so we experience that going back and forth, and the little comments from folks here that haven't quite worked through that belief that, you know, folks in the global South are actually just people same as you know, like strong Palestinian women did not come out of a vacuum, you know, fighting against oppressive men. Like they were empowered by their communities the same as anyone.
So there's one last question, I guess, and I think it's maybe an interesting way. And although it's a question on Palestinian futurism, and although the work really isn't, but I think it's an interesting question to think about, you know, the future. And the question is, do you have any thoughts on Palestinian futurism? Is it productive to create fictional futures?
There's a scholar, Palestinian scholar, her name is Sophia Azib, and she wrote several kind of articles talking about Palestine as flesh, thinking about the body as place, kind of to again theorize on the diaspora as Palestine, wherever they are, as a Palestinian project, as an anti-colonial Palestinian project, wherever they are. In Canada, they're anti-colonial. In the US, they're anti-colonial. As Palestine, expanding and taking up that space, as Serene said. And so from that, thinking about a futurism really kind of is in politicizing the present, I feel, and kind of breaking out from the separation of past, present, and future. And I feel like, the Canada Park is kind of my step into trying to think about that, in the sense that I haven't been here for a long time, so I must say that the part that alludes to that is very short, because I still don't have that relationality with the land and with people and communities, indigenous communities here. But it was alluding to this idea that with a certain way of or land-based practices on stolen land, as Palestinians, we are establishing kind of a futurity for Palestine beyond the national project, and in a sense kind of thinking of it intersectionally as a struggle for justice wherever we are. And again, definitely a narrative experimental framework is the only way to go for me, because you start in the here. You're very much kind of rooted in this place, in this context, and a very thorough political understanding of everything that you're working with, specifically the materiality of your aesthetic, and kind of breaking out of that into a narrative, an experimental space where colonialism does not make sense, because that's where we can create that futurity, that alternative that knows where it's at, but also knows that it's as ubiquitous as it is. There's always a line of flight out of it. And I mean, poetry is where the revolution is at for me.
I really like, I totally agree about like how kind of using surrealism, using like rejecting traditional narrative, anything that kind of breaks the mold allows us to like almost resist normalization. It's kind of what I was hearing, but I'm so drawn to works that are playing with futures, with surrealism, with anything that can't easily be like described even. And I think like in the same way that the land was colonized, and we often talk about that, like the time was colonized, and I already said this a few times, but it's really where my head is at. Like, I'm really drawn to futuristic work, and then I also at the same time struggle so hard to imagine a future, even 5 years from now, but to imagine a radically different future, it's like personally a very difficult process. And I think that's probably why it's important. Like, I think naturally for all of us, it's a hard process. And then the artists who are like engaging with that are actually trying, like as much that personal project of decolonizing internally as it is, one of creating a narrative that's outside of the kind of traditional gaze or whatever.
I think I know who this question came from. kind of thing. But I think it was Godard who said like that basically after the creation of the Israeli state, that basically Israeli filmmakers took to fiction because they're trying to create a narrative of a place, like an attachment to this place, whereas Palestinian filmmakers went to documentary because they're trying to grasp onto what's here now and just kind of to create evidence or trace of who they are and themselves, like tangibility. So I suppose I will echo kind of what Rana said. I feel that this whole idea of like how the occupation and the whole state, the Israeli state, slows time for us as Palestinians, especially Palestinians who live inside those borders, who have to stand at checkpoints and just really stand at checkpoints and, you know, wait for permits and etc. and that. And like, I think it's literally like, yeah, and as well as how much of our culture is kind of had to be stuck in this traumatic moment of like, okay, we're just trying to be who we are, and you know, we don't want to talk about, you know, the soldiers and the guns and the prisons, but like how much you're taking up from our own imagination of the future, violently. And so, would it be nice? Yes, it would. But I think for now, let's just kind of be transnational people and yeah, be playful as much as possible about our work and hopeful about the future.
Yeah, but I mean, just to echo everyone, I think completely. I think that there's something to be said about like, it's important, but I think it's not just so much about imagining the futures. It's about dealing with the now. It's about having alternative narratives. It's about talking about it in different ways. And I think that is the way we kind of imagine our future. And I do think that clearly the violence of, you know, being trapped and, you know, like Rana, you were talking about being trapped in the Nakba, right? Like, or being trapped in those moments. And I think really our work of trying to like expand into the future is that it's not just about us imagining what will happen in 100 years, but it's also about us kind of articulating that way. Specifically, when you think about like the well-noted violence of the Israeli state against the artists, right? Like the Palestinians artists that have been assassinated, the cultural institutions that have been bombed, right? Like, I think it's also about just kind of that violence of limiting our creativity, which I think is really powerful. I think as time is coming to an end, maybe I can ask for kind of final thoughts if anyone has any things that, you know, they'd like to say before we wrap up.
I just wanted to shout out on that note, my mother, Rehab Nazzal's work, which is in the lineup, because, you know, it was composed of thousands of photographs that she took when she was in Bethlehem, while youth were uprising in 2015-16. And during that time, you know, she took one photo that's marked in our minds now forever, of a sniper lying down facing her moments before it shot her in the leg. And so that, like, just to bring that, like, that reality home of like, yeah, how difficult it is to move beyond the now, when the now is so violent towards artists, so violent towards anyone who resists. Yeah.
Guess I'll also send a shout out to Rehab Nazzal, your mother, Rana, because first of all, like, she had you and you were like, I love occupying the same spaces as you and like seeing what's on your mind. And yeah, so salamat, Rehab. And also, yeah, I think Rehab is beyond kind of beyond her artistic practice. I think she's trying to create community among Palestinian diasporic artists, especially in Canada, and just different Palestinians. And I think there's an importance to places like this. And so I guess I'll thank the people who shared with us in our thoughts and all of you.
It's good to be here. Talking to you all. Thank you so much, Khairi and Cinema Politica and Serene and Rana and Rehab as well. I was kind of waiting for her to be with us to talk about the film, but then I realized that, yeah, I wanted to ask her about the silence because I thought that was necessary.
Hopefully we'll have, yeah, a kind of a case, more of a situation where we can bring her on to talk about her work, but definitely work that's very powerful. And for anyone who hasn't seen the work is still available. I know some people may have had problems with the Everbright link, but the work will still be available till Wednesday, and you can see it on Cinema Politica's on demand. So if you haven't seen the work, please check them out. They're all, the work's really interesting from really great artists and filmmakers who I want to thank for being here. Thank you so much. This really has been great and a really fun discussion. I definitely would be happy to continue talking for hours, but time is limited. But thank you so much for your time.